Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles, and I am the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can give us a call at 812-550-6234 or send a text to that same number. You can also send emails to info@riverridgechurch.org. We'd love to hear from you if you have comments or questions or specific requests that you'd like to be addressed or answered on future TV programs. We also have the past TV programs available on our YouTube channel, which I'd encourage you to check out and to subscribe to. It's just River Ridge Church of Christ. And we also welcome you to join us for our Sunday morning worship. That's every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh. We will ask that you bring a mask with you if you're intending to worship with us in person. But there's also the live stream available on the YouTube channel. You can find links to that on our website as well, riverridgechurch.org. I once attended a small-town, rural high school production of Fiddler on the Roof, an experience I fully expected from the start I'd later regret. I do not like musicals, partly because of the wishy-washy, sometimes dramatic, sometimes operatic nature of the thing, and partly because the music is often irritatingly catchy, yet void of any depth or value. Of course, when put on by a high school, the point really has less to do with the artistic production and more to do with kids going out on a limb and parents being proud of them for doing so. But nevertheless, I had every expectation I would happily forget this entire experience immediately. For the most part, that's what happened, but one of these kids, while not musically or dramatically gifted, had a startling level of confidence and charisma that made it obvious why he'd landed the lead role. A Russian Jew at the turn of the 20th century named Tevye, around whom the plot revolves. This kid surprised me, and so his first big song, Tradition, stuck with me. Now, from what I gather, because mercifully that day was the first and last time that I've ever seen Fiddler on the Roof, the story involves Tevye doing his best to live by the traditions passed down by previous generations during a very tumultuous period of radical and often violent social and cultural change. And this song, extolling the virtues of tradition, sets the stage for the struggle that follows in the rest of the play. Back in the real world, this same struggle is often seen, almost always, between the older generation and the younger, in which the elders appeal to their own authority as elders to bring the young whippersnappers in line, and of course the kids scoff at the old-timers and their outdated ideas, resisting their guidance. There's usually fault on both sides, and there's also value on both sides. Jesus himself had to deal with this conflict during his time on earth. One of my favorite examples of this is found in chapter 7 of Mark's Gospel. Here, the Pharisees and scribes notice a breach of etiquette among Christ's disciples, and without a shred of self-awareness, ask him in verse 5, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" Now, Mark has already primed us to see the problem in their notion of authority, pointing out rather deliberately that this group included, first of all, scribes, which he mentions in verse 1, who are experts in the law of Moses, and then Pharisees, who were the most conservative interpreters of that law. Mark also twice calls their scruples tradition, while attempting to demonstrate how ridiculous these traditions had become, before the scribes and Pharisees themselves appealed to what they called the tradition of the elders. Let's read the first 5 verses of chapter 7 of Mark's Gospel together now that we have established some of the background. Now when the Pharisees gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" Now, based on what's been going on in the story around this, we're not talking about just Jesus and his 12 innermost circle disciples. This is a larger group, and most of them are not nearly as attached to Jesus as that core group of 12. And so that highlights the first problem in the judgment that the scribes and Pharisees are passing on Jesus and his disciples here. They are making him responsible for every action taken by anyone who is tangentially connected to him. And that's not exactly fair. I'm sure they wouldn't like it if Jesus applied that same standard in reverse. It's also striking that they only hold him responsible for the bad things that these people do and none of the good things. But on the other hand, it would be difficult to argue that washing before eating is a bad thing. Is Mark saying that we shouldn't take hygiene seriously? Well, no, that's not his point, but he is showing that it can get a little bit excessive, and he doesn't mean just hygiene. That's not really what this tradition is all about. What they're talking about is a ritual purification. The removal of filth is a little bit less in mind, and the restoration of holiness is a little bit more in mind. So this is kind of like that 2-second water splash that guy kind of pretends qualifies as hand washing in the public restroom. Or maybe a more appropriate comparison, considering the times in which we live, would be the mask that you see obviously drooping below that girl's nose or just, hanging around her neck. It's more ritualistic, it's more symbolic than functional or real. Now, of course, that's not to say that Jesus' disciples should have ignored everything that their elders told them. There's no indication that they did, as a matter of fact. And the Bible itself does teach that, in general, the younger should treat those who are older with some level of deference and respect. For example, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5, "Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble." We looked at that verse in a program not too long ago with regard to the humility and the lack of pride, and God opposing the proud, but giving grace to the humble. But let's think about the first part. You who are younger, be subject to the elders. Now, he doesn't confine this humility to those who are younger. He says, all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. But one specific part of that is that those who are younger in general ought to give some significant deference to those who are older and more experienced and wiser. Paul says something similar in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 1, "Do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father, younger men as brothers." Paul is talking to Timothy, who is a relatively younger man, and he's saying that even if an older man is in sin and needs to be corrected, that he should not be rebuked in quite the same way. He should be encouraged as you would encourage your own father. And that kind of deference is reserved for those who are older, because those who are younger, well, treat them as brothers. There's an obvious familial backdrop to this whole thing, where as Christians we ought to be mimicking those roles. And so, of course, one of those elements is that the father, the head of the household, deserves the respect of those who are in his charge. It's not confined to the New Testament either. If you go back to the Old Testament, the book of Proverbs, and look at the first 4 verses of chapter 4, "Hear, O sons, a father's instruction, and be attentive that you may gain insight. For I give you good precepts. Do not forsake my teaching. When I was a son with my father, tender, the only one in the sight of my mother, he taught me and said to me, let your heart hold fast my words. Keep my commandments and live." Well, that seems fairly self-explanatory, but I would like to highlight that in the way that this is rendered here, the father, who is in the process of saying that his son should pay attention to what he has to say, he's saying, look, when I was younger, I paid attention to what my father told me as well, and that helped me to get through life as well as I have. There's a lot of wisdom to be had in those who have been there and done that and are now able to share those experiences with the younger generation. And there are many other more examples like this, especially in the book of Proverbs, but this is a great one for just showing that ideal, the way that it is supposed to be, this wisdom passed down through the generations. When we examine our own traditions, we generally can see the wisdom in them, and we have many of them passed down to us from previous generations. By and large, while they are not commandments of God, they are wise conclusions, sage advice, and good practices that help to safeguard against many different threats. In the context of the church, I would count myself as part of a tradition of, for example, meeting twice on Sundays to worship God, and all the members are encouraged to attend both. Another of these traditions that we tend to observe is a study in the middle of the week, and actually typically falls on Wednesday, and members are expected to attend that as well. Are those commandments of God? No. Are they wise? Definitely. We also have traditions about, say, the order of worship. And of course, we're trying to follow the examples set in the New Testament as far as what we will do, but when to do it and how much to do it and precisely how to do it, well, a lot of Christians have settled mostly by tradition on some of the fine details involved. We also have traditions about how to organize classes, what you might call Sunday school, traditions about the use of hymnals and seating arrangements and who does what and how many times, and perhaps the level of calisthenics that will be expected in the midst of the worship service. Now, and all of these are up for debate. They get tweaked from time to time based on what is needed, what's expedient. But by and large, they're rooted in a common pattern, and they are established by tradition. Mostly these are wise traditions, and they are examples of this generational wisdom about the most effective way to accomplish what God has told us to do. Yet the circumstances do not always lend themselves to the keeping of even wise traditions. Jesus defended his disciples on this account a number of times, and his approach reflects even greater wisdom than the tradition of the elders. In this case that we've been looking at here in Mark's Gospel, you might have expected him to explain the extenuating circumstances at play in this particular instance. But he doesn't do that. Well, then you might have expected him to issue some kind of a smell test, maybe along the lines of what the Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart once gave in talking about how to define obscenity, and particularly pornography, when he said, "I shall not today attempt further to define the kinds of material I understand to be embraced within that shorthand description, and perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so. But I know it when I see it." That is a very useful smell test, and you might have expected Jesus to issue some kind of insightful, clear-cut test by which to determine when it is compulsory to wash the hands and when it is okay not to. But he doesn't do that either. Okay, then you might have expected him to get into a deep discussion of the fine details surrounding a person's responsibility to keep tradition or not, but he doesn't do that. He doesn't do any of these things. Instead, he simply calls out the accuser's hypocrisy and highlights the differences between tradition and commandment, a comparison which does not reflect well on the self-important Pharisees and scribes. Let's read verses 5 through 8. "And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, 'Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?' And he said to them, 'Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men.'" Ouch. Go read Isaiah 29 when this video is over. That's the passage from which Jesus is quoting, and it is about leaders in Jerusalem ignoring God's rules and imposing their own. It says things like, "The wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the discernment of their discerning men shall be hidden." That's in verse 14 of that chapter. "In that day the deaf shall hear the words of a book, and out of their gloom and darkness the eyes of the blind shall see. The meek shall obtain fresh joy in the Lord, and the poor among mankind shall exult in the Holy One of Israel." Those are verses 18 and 19. These people who are accusing Jesus' disciples and implicitly accusing Jesus himself, these scribes and Pharisees, they know that passage. And they know what he's implying by it. He's implying that they're the ones trying to stifle God's word and standing in the way of the Messiah, but that instead the poor and the lowly and the uneducated are turning to him and being blessed. Let's read on, beginning in verse 9. "And he said to them, You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, Honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, If a man tells his father or his mother, Whatever you would have gained from me is korban, that is, given to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. And many such things you do." Okay, so if you're not too familiar with the law of Moses, then this might be a little bit difficult to understand. The idea here is that people were allowed and encouraged to make offerings to God. Sometimes this took the form of animal sacrifice. Sometimes it took the form of some of their produce, whether it was flour or oil or wine. Other times it simply took the form of money. They had a treasury in the temple, and people could bring currency and just drop that into the treasury box. Well, those gifts would then be termed korban, given to God, as Mark helpfully translates it for us here. And they also had this commandment, honor your father and mother, and it was expected that if your father and mother were not doing so well and they needed financial support, that obviously their children ought to take care of them. And we see that's kind of built into us even today, isn't it? We know to take care of our parents when they need our help. It seems only fair since they, took care of us when we needed our diapers changed. But what was happening here is that the Pharisees were saying, in a sense, we're going to prefer giving these gifts to God over honoring father and mother. And so they said, if you are in a bind financially and you have to choose whether to use this money in order to take care of your parents or give it to God, well, if you give it to God, then he'll understand and he won't be mad at you for not taking care of your parents, which is not entirely true. You see, God is quite happy to receive these offerings. There's nothing against that at all. In fact, as I said earlier, he encouraged that. But while he encouraged these free will offerings, he demanded that you honor your father and mother. And the Pharisees were saying, almost in the form of a tax deduction, that, well, if you make this charitable contribution, then we'll let that other thing slide. We won't require it of you. Well, that's not their call. Instead, they've just made up some tradition that they think makes good sense, that they think will be good for the Lord's treasury. Well, it might inflate the Lord's treasury, but it is not exactly increasing the level of righteousness among the populace, is it? They were taking a good thing, making an offering to God, and turning that into a condescending excuse for refusing to care for your own parents. Now, the way that Jesus is arguing here, today we might call it something like deflecting or even whataboutism, because it seems as if he's ignoring the issue at hand, where they say, why are your disciples not washing their hands before they eat? And he says, well, what about you? What about you and how you ignore the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition? Well, that may be true, and maybe we should talk about that. But what about the initial accusation? What about the unwashed hands? He doesn't even bother to fully address that. Yet, he's making a pretty good point. Because it's not just that these scribes and Pharisees don't abide by their own standard. It's that they have the wrong standard. And that's really what Jesus is trying to get at. Now, his reply to them has carefully avoided saying, your traditions don't matter, because that's not really the case. It's just that they are traditions, and traditions, however good, ought not to be considered binding. The Word of God, however, ought not to be ignored. So what about today? Does any of this make any sense in our day and age? Does any of this apply to us? Well, of course it does. In fact, I think this is a very important lesson for all of us to understand and to implement. Live by what God says. And then pay attention to the collective inherited wisdom too. But remember that only one of these is authoritative. It was important to understand that when Jesus walked the earth in the flesh. It was important a year ago, and it'll be important next year and forever until the Lord returns. But we are in a strange position right now, dealing with a dangerous pandemic and a dangerous pandemic response as well. Also rising racial tensions and increasing violent crime in most major cities. Thank God not in Evansville. Let's keep it that way. We have to deal with a major upheaval of our traditions right now. And we would do well to heed Jesus' words in all of our decision making. Now, it's understandable that many people are chafing under these new norms, these new policies, and whether it's the masks or the lockdowns or the restrictions or the half capacity at restaurants. All of these things are very frustrating, and they definitely upset what we've gotten used to. And we are left seemingly kind of trying, for example, to juggle the commandment to love the Lord and the commandment to love our neighbors when they appear to be irreconcilable. Now, of course, this is not the first time that Christians have faced such a quandary. The New Testament is filled with examples of these things happening. We just usually don't think about them in quite those terms. So, for example, in the book of Acts in chapter 6, in this case, we see some cultural tensions because there were a bunch of Hebrew-speaking Jews and there were also a bunch of Greek-speaking Jews. The Greek-speaking Jews, many of them came from outside the borders of Israel, and they happened to be in Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost when, they became Christians and they decided to stick around where the other Christians were. And that was great, but we have this language barrier and this culture barrier and some tension as a result. And so what was happening was that there were widows both among the Hebrew-speaking Jews and among the Greek-speaking Jews, and the church was going out of its way to take care of their physical needs, but the Greek-speaking Jews were being ignored. They were being neglected, and they weren't being provided for as well as they should have been. Well, obviously there, God's commandment to love your neighbor should dictate, let's jump on this right away and take care of the problem. But at the same time, the apostles recognized that this is going to distract them from their work of serving the Lord in even greater ways than this. Let's read verses 2 through 4 of Acts chapter 6. And the 12 summoned the full number of the disciples and said, "It is not right that we should give up preaching the word of God to serve tables. Therefore, brothers, pick out from among you 7 men of good repute, full of the Spirit and of wisdom, whom we will appoint to this duty. But we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word." Well, that's not traditional. It's as if they just made this up off the top of their heads. But it addresses both needs. It allows the apostles to focus their service on the Lord, and it also makes sure that these poor widows were not being neglected. A few chapters later in Acts 10, we see another similar situation. This time it's not so much cultural as racial tensions between Jew and Gentile. It was considered at that time that only Jews could become Christians because, Jesus is a Jew and salvation comes first to the Jews. That was certainly, by that point, the traditional view on the matter, and yet God told them differently. In Acts chapter 10, verse 15, Jesus tells Peter, "What God has made clean, do not call common." And that was his way of indicating, look, the Gentiles are not off limits. The Gentiles are not common in the way that you think. Well, now certainly we have a conflict because the traditional view goes directly against the Lord's commandment. And so Peter has to figure out how to convince his fellow Jewish Christians to accept the Gentiles. It took a lot of work, but it was the right thing to do, and it worked. Later in Acts chapter 15, the same set of racial tensions kind of plays out again because it was felt that, yes, Gentiles can become Christians, but they have to become Jews first. So the tradition said they ought to keep the law of Moses, but God hadn't actually said that. And they were in a situation where appeasing the traditional Jewish mindset among the Christians would have laid an unjust burden on the Gentiles. But being fair to the Gentiles would have upset the Jews. And so how do they handle it? Well, they sit down and they talk about it, and they learn, and they realize what God really intends, and eventually decide we have to buck this tradition in favor of God's commandment and what is upbuilding for everyone. All three of these examples are instances where Christians, apostles no less, struggled to one degree or another with this balance. And it's not until a solution is found in each case that it becomes clear there really is no conflict between the two commandments, to love your God and love your neighbor. As we all wrestle through this frustrating and seemingly unending attempt to preserve lives and avoid enabling or contributing to our neighbor's suffering, let's keep in mind that stopgaps and substitutes and solutions to the current problems can and must be found without rejecting God's commandments. They won't often adhere to the tradition of the elders, though. They're going to be different, and you're probably not going to like them. And that's okay, considering the circumstances, but we should all look forward to a time when we can again make use of the wisdom passed down to us from previous generations. In Proverbs chapter 22, verse 28, it says, "Do not move the ancient landmark that your fathers have set." Don't let this isolated, divisive, godless mentality that is becoming the norm lately be normal for you. Work on keeping Jesus' commandments and join yourself together with others who share that goal. If you are interested to learn more about His commandments, then I encourage you to tune in again next week, or you can head over to our channel page on YouTube. Just search River Ridge Church of Christ and you'll find it as the first result. And there you can find many more installments of this TV program and answers to specific questions. You can also find our Bible classes and our live stream up there as well. And of course, there will be more to come next week. This program is presented by the River Ridge Church of Christ in Newburgh, Indiana. We welcome your comments and questions, also requests, whether that is for specific topics to be addressed or a request to sit down and study sometime. We would love to accommodate that as well. You can get in touch with us at 812-550-6234 or info@riverridgechurch.org. I hope this has been a worthwhile study for you, and I thank you for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.